Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Coffee Chat with CastleHill. I'm joined by Pete Martin today, our head of our Archer services, and one of our principals overall. And we're going to talk about something which sounds very mundane, but is actually really important to your GRC program and your risk management capabilities. And that's around attestations and how you can do attestations in a tool like Archer in a very consistent way and really drive the value of the platform and the consistency of the user experience, and therefore get better answers from people. So, welcome, Pete. Thanks for joining me again. So let's talk a little bit about that, Pete. So, we've built some of this capability, and as we often try to do at Castle Hill, right? We're not trying to build something one-off. We're not building the unitasker type of activity. We want to be able to use something in a consistent way across the platform, and what you've done with the attestation framework is really interesting. So maybe let's talk about the framework part of it first, and then we'll talk about more specifics around some examples. So tell me a little bit about the framework.
So the framework is basically designed to build a scalable process to implement attestations across the enterprise, whether it's model risk, SOX, or even something as simple as, well, I shouldn't say simple, but IAM, right? Doing identity access and management within Archer. You can do it specific to, Archer access, or bring in access and roles and do certifications on those for systems outside of the platform as well. But trying to give a centralized and a consistent process and methodology to implementing those and deploying those, which will bring a benefit both to the end users, those people that have to perform those certifications, the people that own the certifications, and as administrators, people that have to support them from a technical perspective.
And I think the administrator part of it, let's start there. So how is this benefiting the administrator? Right? What's different about this approach?
So, depending on how clients do it currently, sometimes these people are doing these offline. They're sending emails, they have spreadsheets, SharePoint sites, etc. But for those people that are maybe already doing it in Archer, at least at previous places I've worked and clients we've supported, a lot of times there's these ad hoc requests to come out and to create a massive data import, to create a bunch of certifications and maybe link them to all the business processes that a person owns, right? And so they're doing certification that way. So part of what this methodology does, it's part of it's just implementing things to allow this to happen more automatically or more systematically, and let the tool and the connections that are already inherent within the platform really drive your attestation content.
And from a Archer system administrator perspective, is this harder, easier, more challenged?
I would say there's a little bit more time up front, but once you do it, it's more of a click of a button thing. Okay, well, now run this data feed to create the certifications. Maybe you give them a report, for example, and uses a report to see, well, this is sort of your certification content. This is what's about to be created. And then you have a data feed that just runs off of that report and creates those attestations. So you're less likely to have issues versus getting a file and having to do a validation, load it up. And that can just get very complicated, and things can get lost with Excel, as I'm sure you're probably familiar with.
Or the fun import? Yes.
People give misaligned values, right? And so if you're using data within the platform, these values will align, and there's no mystery. So it's just a much more simpler process to do that. And if you get a bit more mature, you can also get to the point where you're putting their attestation language in Archer and letting those end users, these program people, actually even set that up and determine what the attestation language is, literally on an attestation by attestation basis, and really give them full control on the content of their attestations and the timing of when they get created. So there are variable levels of maturity to it, but the starting point is just getting these attestations in Archer and leveraging, for instance, like the contacts app to simplify, different things like report building, notifications, etc., and giving end users, both on the program side and the people that may have to certify, sort of centralized landing points to see what's out there for them.
So I know one of the complaints that we often hear about with folks who are heavy Archer users is, of course, that they get 10 different questionnaires and they're structured differently and they have other things like that. So this really gets away from that in a lot of ways, right? So you're still working through the Archer UI, but now perhaps you're working through it much more consistently from an end user perspective.
Yep, and that's part of it too. There's a bit of a sales job from from a administrator perspective, because you're trying to talk these different areas. It's like, well, we don't have to make, we're not going to tell you how to set up the questions or identify what questions you have in your certification or your attestation. But what we're trying to do is literally get a very similar look and feel to the structure of it, using ideally similar status values, a similar sign-off process, whether you're using the process that will create, require like a PIN code for those end users and ultimately create like a PDF version, right? That special advanced workflow feature, but just really trying to be very consistent in how you use it, using similar status values, using similar field names, similar date name, right, for date fields, etc. Right. So if I'm certifying in 3-4 different areas, I everything's pretty much apples to apples when I go between them.
So that you just touched on something which is also interesting, that your methodology for the attestation can now include, with some of the newer features of Archer, you can now include some of those, two-factor authentication, almost, whatever certification result activities.
Yeah, and that's helpful for an instance where you might do like calculated cross references and pull in every process where this person's the process owner. Well, those can change over time, but through that process, it will create a PDF version, a snapshot, point in time version of what they certified to. So that's really the big benefit with something like that, and you can make sure that there's not some system admin that's coming in and performing the attestation on their behalf.
That's another interesting aspect of it when we look at it from a traceability perspective and all those pieces, right? The advantage to having this framework is all of those traceability aspects, and really getting that, all joking aside, getting audit to be able to look at these things in a consistent way, making their job easier, and in most cases, then making the attestation certification much more straightforward, right?
Yeah, and it also, I mean, I think there's a benefit too in that the certain processes, if it is more file based, etc., there's a lot of time it takes to set those up, and so those things, all this is moving targets, right? Where if you use a more automated fashion, right, using this framework, this approach, especially if you're leveraging wholly on Archer data, right, and links within the platform, it's when it's so quick to create the attestations, everything's going to be exact, right, and everything's a very accurate at the time that they do their certification. You don't have to worry, well, somebody changed roles 3 weeks ago and nobody told us, right? If it's in the system, as long as that system's up to date and somebody changes their name 3 minutes later, they could have a new attestation for them.
Let's talk about a more specific example, right? So I know we started this really looking at the access for systems like Archer, right, which is a little bit of an unusual beast relative to the identity and access management space. And that was sort of one of the places we first looked at this, beyond things like you mentioned, like model risk and some other common attestation pieces. Why don't you talk a little bit about the actual applications that we've deployed and effectively can provide to customers as an out of the box type of a solution?
Sure. So we have that meta detective accelerator, which we use to create and manage content about the platform. So identifying the different applications out there, the questionnaires, the names of our groups, and then using contacts, linking contact records for our employees to the groups, group records that they belong to within the platform. And so having all of that as content in the system, now it's as simple as just putting like a trigger date and having a date that we want a certification to be created or attestation to be created. And we have a report that already says, well, these are the people that are tied to these groups. Now go create an attestation for every group owner. It links to their group records, and they can see the user accounts or the names of the people that are in those groups and do a certification. Say, yes, not only are the groups that I have accurate, and the intent, the purpose of those groups is still accurate as defined, but now the people in it are still accurate. Conversely, from a management perspective, if you're using contacts and have that management hierarchy in there, you can do a similar attestation, but from that manager perspective, and say, here's the list of all. Here's an attestation for you as a manager, and that would link to the contact records for your direct reports. And within those contact records, you'll be able to see the list of groups within the platform that they have access to. Or if you're bringing in data from external to Archer, you would see sort of all groups, right? All roles, whether it's Active Directory, Office 365, right? Any external data source where these people have to get additional access.
So just to right, so say I'm a fictitious person named Chad or something like that, and right, so Chad's a manager, Chad's a owner of a group. Instead of Chad having to go through multiple different types of processes to attest to the group being there, so getting an email from some system admin in Archer and saying, "Hey, this is what your business definition of your group is. Can you validate it?" And having that sort of a trail, or having a spreadsheet of these are all the people who have in your group that have access to it, and finding out that it's three people who no longer work in this group, two people who don't exist, all those things, all of that is basically automated through the power of the system and the features that you got to use anyway, right?
Yep, exactly. Or people are using, nicknames or whatever too, right? It's no, this is the exact person. There's no Jimbo in here, right? It's James. It's everything's very formal, official, and aligns to at least the user accounts as are identified in the platform.
So what's the big negative, right? What's the challenge of this, and why would people not want to use this if there's a reason?
I mean, admittedly, it takes a little bit of time to set up, but I think from what I've seen, I don't think that time is much greater at all than the, say, quarterly process it takes to set these attestations up, right? So the big thing is you have to, one way or another, get that content into the platform. But once it's in the platform, it's pretty easy to build the reports that you need that generate your attestations. So I really think, the time saver, at least in my experience, can be quite massive. Previous place I worked, I think we were saving probably, even on the Archer, on the admin team, we were probably saving 10 to 20 hours in attestation a quarter. And when you have 20 attestations, that adds up over time.
And it's becoming even more important with a lot of I think it's becoming more important with even the regulatory changes that are coming through, and the need for contingency planning to be asking people those types of assessment questions and validating data that is in the system that's coming now through spreadsheets and other interesting mechanisms.
Yep. Yeah. I mean, it's nice, normalized, the reporting simple out of the system, right? Because these aren't complex data layers of information that we have out here, right? It's usually pretty simple. Here's my contact record. Here's the process. Here's my contact record. Here's the models I'm tied to, right? It's a very simple extract for that. And you can classify your certifications by the month, quarter, whatever, right? It's very easy to do reporting on that sort of criteria as well. Business unit, whatever, right? As long as it's an attribute in that certification, it's a very simple thing to report on.
It's interesting because this also gets tied into some of the third party or other pieces like that, or for companies that have a distributed operation. Was just talking with somebody about the whole exchange vulnerability that recently surfaced, right? And so when you look at an ad hoc attestation and the amount of effort to spin up an ad hoc attestation and go through that process, this would massively simplify it, right? So if you needed to send out a quick attestation to people saying, are you running this, have you implemented these capabilities, and thinking of some of our clients that have worldwide presences, and the ability to send this out quickly and get that attestation and understanding of those things would be important.
Yeah, I mean, especially with contacts being sort of that targeted application for really almost every attestation you have out there, right? Because one person certifies to X, whatever X is. When you talk about something that's more of an ad hoc one-off, attestations are inherently fairly simplistic. There's not really much from a workflow perspective. There's not like a complicated approval process, right? They just come in and they certify or they don't. So that, from a configuration perspective, it's easy to build out and implement a one-off certification. But now when you bring in reference contacts, right, it's easy to set a flag and say, well, for these contacts, create this new certification record, and that you could spin that up very quickly, same day, depending on the complexity, if the push is really there. But yeah, very, very simple to implement something like that.
So you mentioned also doing things in our access attestation around getting data from Office 365 and other Active Directory and systems like that. So what are the techniques that we're using to get that data into the same process?
I mean, any way you can use to integrate and get that content into the platform. So as long as you have a landing page or landing place, I should say, that's consistent. So for instance, we have a groups application that we've used. The centralized or the initial purpose of that was for the Archer groups and build content for Archer groups and associated contact records for people that have access to those groups. But it's just as simple to integrate, whether it's a simple data import, or if you have it in a place where you can use like an API, and pull that content in. As long as there's user information for those external groups, again, Office 365 as an example, we can go and create records for each Office 365 group or role, and then align it to their contact record for the people that are, that have that access, right? And now you have a real simple way of reporting across multiple applications and the access people they have in them, because all of these groups, whether it's Archer Group, Office 365, whatever, they're all in this quote unquote groups application, one centralized landing point. And it's just an attribute, right? What is the application this group is tied to, or the external, the source for this application?
And that's a key part of it, right? Is these are attributes that we're aligning to the different, different native functions within the platform, right? These are just, we're not creating a whole new set of on-demand applications or things of that sort to sort of leverage the contacts app or things of that sort. It's really using some of these native features of the platform, which I think are very powerful.
Exactly. Yep. Yeah. I mean, and the questionnaires too, from an attestation perspective, there's less of an issue because that's not a licensing problem. So you would still probably want to leverage questionnaires for the attestations themselves. But like you mentioned, you're using contacts as the primary target for all of these, which I think everybody has that licensed as a starting point. And then you could probably just have a few other, depending on what you're certifying to, whether it's business processes, great. Well, most people probably have that business process application licensed, and they have their content in the system. Third parties, models, right? These are all things that are probably inherently a part of your risk management workspace out there. Or if it's something like groups, it's very easy to integrate. And like you said, it's probably, you could do it, have a multifunctional from a data source or application perspective, ODA that you can leverage just to drop all of your groups in.
Make it very simple. Well, this has really been interesting, Pete. I think what would you leave people with as a last thought relative to this? I think we've gone through a lot of different areas, but take it back up a level. And what's the key takeaway?
I think the key thing is if you are having a big pain point identifying how to not even customize, but just try to streamline your attestation process and get a grapple on that. Like, that's the first thing. We can help with that. And second, if you want to build it within in a more manageable, like, systematic process, great, we can help you with that too. So we can kind of help you on both fronts, right? How do we get a handle on what we're trying to have people certified to and make that more consistent? And then how do we simplify our ongoing process to distribute those attestations?
So simplify the process, make it easier for the admins, and at the end of the day, user experience improves. All those things, right?
Yeah, there's just that sort of ripple effect. If you make it better from an admin perspective, both on the program side and the Archer side, you're definitely going to make it easier for your end users too.
Makes everything better. Awesome. Thanks, Pete. I really appreciate you joining me today and talking about the attestation framework and some of the specifics behind it. Great job that you and the team have done on this, and really appreciate you joining me again. Thank you.
Thank you. Yep.
Have a good day.